Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That music means the Hillsdale Dialogue is upon us. In fact, it's part 7 of our deep dive into the Plato's Dialogue, the Republic. Let me start with let's go there. I'll start with you, Dr. O'Toole. 413D. So we must watch them straight from childhood by setting them a task in which a man would most likely forget and be deceived out of such a conviction. And the man who has a memory and is hard to be deceived must be chosen, and the one who's not must be rejected. It gets very extraordinarily detailed in how parents aren't going to raise their children. The city's going to raise their children. It's sort of like the progressives, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, kind of the point that my father-in-law is making is that the Republic is an experiment in political idealism. It shows the dangers of self-interested and self-seeking rulers, men whose lusts and longing for domination and honor are out of control, overtly and obviously. But more subtly and more importantly, I mean, both points are important, but is its treatment of political idealism. And in a way, the more radical or dangerous forms of tyranny is the form of tyranny that's a consequence of those who want to make the world perfectly just. And I mean, you know, I think Kamala Harris has said very useful things about this. First of all, early on, 4 years ago, but it seems so long ago, she was making a big deal about the distinction between equality and equity. And one of her catchphrase lines that is used today is that she wants us to dream of a world where we're unburdened by the past. I can't remember the bizarre way in which she exactly puts it, but unburdened by the past, meaning we can overcome the effects of the past, meaning nature and all historical or supposedly historical injustice or supposed injustice, you could say. Overcome every basic limitation that have been imposed upon people simply by the nature of things in the course of events. And now the Republic doesn't quite go that far. There's never a promise to overcome nature, strictly speaking. But it is an attempt to draw out or build a world that's perfectly just, and that means perfectly rational. And the tricky and difficult thing about Plato is he never lets you off the hook by simply saying, well, look, you just got to shrug your shoulders and see how awful or bad this is. You have to see that there's a part of us that wants something like this. You have to see that there's a case for it, and then you start to recognize, yes, but it goes too far, or it cuts against the grain too much of something natural and powerful in us. So in a way, yes, there's an argument for rational rulers selecting the best children, educating them fully, not leaving their education up to their parents who don't know any better, who don't fully know how to educate the children as well as rational rulers do. And so, and there's a case for a kind of rigid hierarchy built and enforced by those rulers. Now, that to our minds, yes, sounds very dangerous and destructive, but one has to see the appeal of that. Because in doing so, you can finally achieve or build a class or elite of people who's reasonable, who knows how to rule, who aren't wise fools or self-interested rulers. And this is, in a sense, what the progressives hope to do. They want to do something exactly like that. The Republic allows us to see why exactly that isn't ultimately really possible, and the full attempt to pursue it isn't even really desirable either.
Dr. Arnn,
I'd like to ask a question. I want to ask a question of Dan. Dan He knows the political philosophy terms of art really well. And sometimes he uses the word rational as a semi-pejorative. And I'd like him to explain that.
Yeah. Well, usually I mean it to be a good thing. And I think Socrates does too. Rational, just seeing the world clearly and honestly, understanding the nature of things. But it's the case that, there's, in the way that we often speak, there's a kind of confusion. When one thinks of being truly rational, one thinks of wisdom. That is not just technical or specific knowledge about things, but knowledge of what's good, knowledge of how things work in the whole world and how they relate to each other and what to prioritize. You can say that's wisdom. By contrast, there are people who are rationalistic. Maybe rationalistic is a good thing to distinguish from rational. People who are rationalistic expect things in the world to be more rational or controllable than in fact they are. And so, the hope or the expectation, for instance, that the progressives or somebody like Critias, who we were just talking about, who didn't really understand Socrates, what they hoped for is that you could have a kind of clear scientific management of human affairs. That is, you could fully know what it is that people should be doing, and you can direct them or provide proper incentives or nudge them to do those things exactly. Now, Socrates doesn't promise anything like that. The hope is merely that a kind of wisdom can rule over the world. And what Socrates shows is even that ultimately isn't available, though in certain cases some kind of wisdom can rule for some period of time.
Well, let me say, that's very good. And I knew that's what he meant, but I wondered if the audience did. And the point is, it is unreasonable to try to enshrine the most reasonable as absolute rulers.
Yeah.
And the reason is nobody is that. And men are not angels, and angels do not govern men. And, one of the tricks or one of the puzzles at the end of the Republic is the philosophers need to rule, and they don't want to. Right, because they've got something better to do, which is one of the reasons they're qualified to rule. And so if you set out to perfect things, and see, that's, I like that rationalistic, like idealism is not a good thing, and ideals are a very good thing. And so if you try to stamp down on the world.
Do either of you think is possible to do what Socrates proposes that the ideal city will do, which is separate children by the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron? Does anyone believe that's even possible at whatever age he believes his education system should begin?
Well, in my work, it is somewhat possible. Because you can tell a lot about them, right? They tell you. And on the other hand, you have to remember that their work is in them, and you're not molding them, you're helping them. And any molding that goes on, and there's a lot of it, they are doing it, right? Yeah. And you just help them do it. And so there's one of my favorite arguments in Christian doctrine is that it indicates a limit on God, which God accepts, because he can't both leave us free and then at the same time make sure we do everything perfect. And it's like, can you make a round square, right? Can't be done. As C.S. Lewis puts it, in the universe that God has created, the law of contradiction rules. And so the point is, we attribute utter power to God, but also moderation, acceptance of the facts, right? And so in my opinion, in the modern world, the greatest approximation of the ideal republic is in the Constitution of the United States. Because what it does is it tries to set up a system where our reason is placed in control of the government and our passions are controlled by it, which is one prescription, one motto you could get out of Plato's Republic. But How does it do that? It does that recognizing that men are not angels and angels don't govern men. And so power is divided and things take time and all the decisions are not made at once. And there takes a series of elections to make big changes, all those things, right? And that too, they believe, that system they think is the best ever devised. And they think it depends upon good character in the people and occasional real leadership. And that not more than occasional, which means there's chance in our republic, because you don't always get that when you need it.
Amen to that. Stand by. We'll be right back. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All Hillsdale Dialogues at hughforhillsdale.com, including the first 6 in this series. hughforhillsdale.com, or go to hillsdale.edu for everything Hillsdale, including an application for you and your fellow students. Stay tuned.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The Hillsdale Dialogue underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I interrupted you, Dr. Larry Arnn. Let's go back to you on that.
You know, remember this. They thought they were making something that would last, but they also thought it depends, because we're not perfect and we can't be.
We are.
And see, if you.
We are in
it's a simple
the
thing.
middle of a constitutional crisis right now. So, because our president is incapacitated, that's my opinion. It is not the opinion of Hillsdale College or of Dr. Arnn or of Dr. O'Toole, but it is my opinion that he's incapacitated and we don't have a president. But I do believe the Constitution is very strong, the strongest in the world, and that we'll get through this. But it's also on the edge. I think people need to understand when they read the Republic, they're reading about ideas that are current right now and are dangerous. And I think, Professor O'Toole, that's what you were saying about the progressives and Vice President Harris's past statements without being political. You were saying she has sometimes lapsed into this absurd notion that we can perfect the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to add something to what Dr. Arnn's saying. One of the striking things, the famous formulation that Madison uses is that men are not angels and we're not always going to be ruled by angels. I always butcher the line, so he can correct me. But there's another formulation he uses, which I'll also butcher slightly, a parallel passage in another Federalist paper, where he says that men will not be governed by Plato's race of philosopher kings, and men will not become philosophers. And so in both, it's obvious he means more or less the same thing in both passages, that men won't become, the whole lot of men cannot become simply enlightened or wise. And that's a teaching of the Republic. But also, you can't expect even your rulers to simply be virtuous and wise for many reasons. But maybe the most obvious is that it's super hard for those with power, those with force in the community, to really know and recognize who the wise and good are. Now, the founders, I think, they're not Platonists exactly. They've learned from the tradition. One thing they understand is that you need a solid constitutional order, but you can't. It's not merely a solid constitutional order that will protect you. And so there's a lot, it turns out, when you read them, about the importance of moral education for everybody, and about maintaining a kind of common set of beliefs, a commitment to the Constitution and its principles, having a martial people, a people that's willing to defend itself and defend its rights. And they pay particular attention to elite education, which is one of the things we're talking about now. I mean, you could say the Republic is about elite education more than anything else. And
thank you. That's what it is. It's about elite education.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exclusively.
I want to.
Yeah.
Dan had many great passages in the previous things, but I'll name two. One of them, he talks about the danger of a professional military. And in Athens, in Sparta, there was a sort of constitutional system where the farmers fought, and they were protecting their own property. Yeah. And Rome's history is driven a lot by the fact they needed the plebeians to serve in the army, and that meant the plebeians had some power. It was a distribution of power. And when you get a professional military, you can, read the stories of the FBI, which in my opinion has been a great thing various times in the past, but not so great right now. And another thing he said was that music, he gave the best definition of music that I can recall reading in my long life. He said, it just means liberal education. It means the study of the proper things so that you know that things are real and arranged in a hierarchy and understand the hierarchy some. And so it's a very big word, and it's distracting because music, we know, is very powerful. I went to a great concert here last night by John McLaughlin Williams, who's a great violinist and pianist, and hazed out some because he didn't like wokeness in music, but he's one of the best, right? And that was very powerful, right? But it's one of many things that make up an education that are very powerful.
Hold it right there, Dr. Arnn. There are many things that make up an education that are powerful. We got to go to break, though. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All the prior episodes in the series with Dr. Arnn and Dr. O'Toole about the Republic are at hillsdale.com. Please stay tuned. Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt, the Hillsdale Dialogue underway. We're talking about music and the Republic, and Dr. Arnn, Dr. Daniel O'Toole are my guests, as usual. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I interrupted you, Dr. Arnn?
And to add to a love of music, you have to come to an understanding of it using words about why it's powerful and what its direction is. And so that we have been blessed in America for most of our history. Did you know that liberal education, in the proper sense, died in America at least 50 years later than it did on the continent? And the rot started on the continent, and it's spread everywhere now. Well, not quite everywhere, but it's, thank God for it. But giving up on that, because what do you do? What am I going to do with that young man? I'm going to teach him that there are real things to know and that it is noble and high and ambitious to pursue them. And he wants that very much. Very odd young man. He's diffident and fun and confused, right? Yeah. But I think there's a lot of good in there, right? And I think he will draw it out. And I'm going to help him. And that's liberal education. That's what it's for, you see.
Do either
of you
consider
attempted to educate Alcibiades, and he did educate Xenophon. He did 1 for 2.
Okay, so he
did.
Do either of you consider John Marshall a founder and a framer? I do, but it is controversial in the legal academy.
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah,
do you?
Okay, so
Of course.
he writes in McCullough versus Maryland.
That's an easy one.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Quote, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means that are appropriate, that are plainly adapted to that end, that are not prohibited, but consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. I warn people that whenever anybody quotes that, the Constitution is in danger because it begins with let the ends be legitimate. And you two are talking about teaching people about what are legitimate ends. And that's not a given. Marshall takes it as a given. It's not a given. And that's, well, I think, go ahead.
First of all, that debate, right? What does necessary and proper mean?
Yes.
That debate, there's never been, in my opinion, a dispositive account of that because it's a matter of prudence. But the protections Madison writes are not in any narrow list of what the government may do. He says explicitly, it's the structure of the government. And the danger today is not that the government is mixed up in electric power and everything else. It's that it's mixed up in everything else.
In everything.
And then in addition, it proceeds under a different structure, right? Yeah. Now, the laws are not made in the Congress. It's even controversial how many agencies make them. The government, since I looked this up the other day, I had cause to, the economy has grown 1,700% since 1930. And you can mark 1930 as the year that the new understanding of America became institutionalized in the Roosevelt administration. The government has grown the economy has grown 1,700% since then, and the government has grown 10,000%, more than that. And it's now half the economy. In 1930, it was 12%, which was about where it was, 8 to 12% for first half of American history. Now, the other change, in 1930, over 60% of the money was raised and spent in cities and counties and towns. Now that number is under 20%. Just over 20% in 1930 was spent in the federal government. Now that's over 60%. So the government has been increased in size massively. Yep. It has been centralized. That means the money is moved away from the people. And we make our laws outside the elected branch. And so that's a change in the form of the government, which is very significant. And it corresponds with a change in the purpose or the final cause of the government. And that's why we're in a constitutional crisis. And Marshall's view of necessary and proper was expansive. And so was Hamilton's, and so were the Federalists as a rule. And that's what they fought with Jefferson and Madison about. Theirs was restricted. But Madison's own testimony says the real point is not exactly there, not exactly what's on the list. The real point is whether the structure holds or not. And that's
the strongest thing they built. And I've been teaching students for 27 years. That's the genius. It's strong. But Dr. O'Toole, how do you teach your students which ends are legitimate? In this book, in book 4, I think, wisdom, courage, temperance, and let me look at my notes, and justice are the ends of the just state. How do you teach them that, and if you even agree with that?
Yeah, or wisdom. I mean, what I have to say just about the Marshall point, he's making it very clear that there are specific enumerated powers within the Constitution.
And Dan, he doesn't
to justify that you can do.
He doesn't.
That you can do in order to satisfy those powers, but I don't think you can just make up. He's not, as I read what you're reading from McCullough, you can just make up new ends or purposes and attach them to the Constitution. It's what's necessary.
He inflated necessary and proper and left it there to be abused. He absolutely inflated the necessary and proper clause beyond anybody's imagining. And it's, of course, been abused since then.
Well, but see, that's a question of too much and too little, right? It's a prudential question. And the danger in his day, because why did the Articles of Confederation fail?
Too little.
It failed because too little, right? And that meant that And it's not just that the federal central government couldn't pay its debts, couldn't put an army in the field, a million things it needs to do. Actually, not a million, defense and a few others. But in addition, states were becoming abusive of people's rights. And that's because they were overtaken, some of them by majority factions. And so the constitutional system does make the central government stronger, but it also divides power so that both levels of government are checked by each other. And so that system, right, and Marshall was not against that system. Marshall was a profound exponent of that system. And if you've got doubts about McCulloch versus Maryland, you got to believe that Marbury versus Madison is a great decision, because it means the Supreme Court becomes an agent to protect the Constitution from the invasions by ordinary law. And that means if the Constitution says X, you can do, and you're convicted of having done X by a statute, you get hauled up before a court, and ultimately the highest court even can let you go. And that's a protection of the citizens' rights and of the structure of the Constitution.
I think it's. I've heard versions of this. Well, I fully agree with what my father-in-law said. I just, I've heard versions of this argument that the New Deal secretly emerged from Hamilton or Marshall's brain, and it's just strains. I mean, it's the national bank is so radically different from the massive expansion of government and the blending of powers of the government that began in the New Deal. I mean, the Federalists are clear enough. Yeah, we want a stronger national government, but mostly to facilitate interstate commerce and to make sure that the government can protect the people. Those are the powers and ends of the national government that they routinely list and talk about, not regulating the affairs of particular businesses, telling them who they can and cannot hire, spying on average American citizens, regulating what they say. That is something that's built up in the 20th century. And there's a lot that the Federalists say that would lead you to think, I think correctly, that they're worried about that very danger, and not merely trying to empower the government to regulate any and every activity that people could be engaged in. So I don't know. I think this.
I've got to correct you both on a prudential question, an inconvenient fact.
Okay, yeah.
The very first lesson.
Sorry.
The very first thing I learned in college from a guy named James Q. Wilson was about the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in the 1880s, I believe. It's 50 years before FDR. In the 1880s, we established a, quote, independent regulatory commission.
Yeah.
Not going to debate that right now, whether or not there are such things. But Dr. Arnn, isn't that the beginning of the breakout of the administrative state, which has grown like kudzu since then?
Yeah, but what I said was institutionalized, right? In other words, now there's a political majority for this, operating explicitly under these purposes, right? And that wasn't true in 1880. Woodrow Wilson certainly had those purposes, but he didn't get a majority. He had war, and I think he had both houses of Congress for a while, but not long. And so with Roosevelt and the Great Depression and the Second World War were both helpful to him, and he got 4 terms to 3.5 terms, 3 1/4 terms to pursue all of this in the name of all of this. And that's what's different. See,
the other inconvenient truth is City of Euclid versus Ambler, which I think is 1923, where the Supreme Court, after Wilson has some appointments, but before it becomes crazy, before Roosevelt, upholds zoning. And zoning would have been an anathema to the framers.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges, and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. Last radio hour of the week, the Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of the prior conversations about the Republic with Dr. O'Toole and Dr. Arnn, or about many other things, there are 800 of them, are found at hugh4hillsdale.com. And I'm arguing, we went to break, I was arguing with Dr. Arnn and Dr. O'Toole. Let's go back and again, no disrespect. I'm just arguing with you guys that the descent from the constitutional order begins significantly prior to the New Deal. It begins with the progressive, because zoning takes away.
We agree.
Let the record show that we have not found either of these points inconvenient.
Yes.
It's the point is, the idea is, there's who was it? I'm going to remember now. Some friend of mine 30 years ago. Tom Engelman is his name. And he gave a great paper about, and Charles Kessler has written about this too, William Graham Sumner, right? And that's 19th century, long about the time of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And he's all over these new ideas, right? Which means, but the ideas are in Hegel, and that's, early 19th century.
So can we get back? That's more important to me than not being able to inconvenience either of you, is whether or not we can get back to the original structure of the Constitution, and if the Republic gives us any hope that we might be able to do so.
Well, we're getting back right now, right? What's gone wrong, in my opinion, is we adopted a utopian dream and institutionalized it. And it's gone through the stages now. And the first stage is, wow, isn't this exciting? And it doesn't make very much difference. Those are the kinds of arguments the progressives meant for it to make a very big difference. But the arguments they made was just, each little detail is something cool and doesn't change anything. And it goes through that, and then it gets institutionalized, and accountability wanes. And the next stage is corruption, people taking care of themselves instead of the public interest. And that's bound to happen because they're people, right? They're not worse, better, they're people. And I think we're in the stage now of, something like wickedness. I think. Oh,
it's not.
They don't.
It's
they
not
don't
far
believe
removed.
as much.
If it's not wicked, it's not far removed, because the administrative state is now trying to tell us that biology is not biology. And I think the new Title IX regulations, which have been put on hold, which I don't think would apply to Hillsdale College, and I don't want to get you guys involved in litigation, but Title IX, if the progressive rewrite of it goes through, will oblige high schools to allow boys to play girls' sports. That's as radical, that's very Platonic, isn't it? That's the Republic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and remember, in the name, and in this case, it isn't a joke or a puzzle.
Right.
And it doesn't attempt to proceed toward wisdom. It proceeds toward science, which is now an exercise of power. And see, I think the reason I think it's rather wicked is that it is openly cynical now. There's who's running for president. Sometimes you could think there's two people named Donald Trump running for president, but they're very different. Right? And that means that that's why I think maybe, I'm hesitant to call anybody wicked, and I don't call anybody particular wicked, but there is a wickedness abroad, right? That now, in the last stages of the Soviet Union, the nomenclatura, that's the name for the people who have a name, right? That's what that means, I guess. And they were the ones who had the privileges. but they didn't really believe anymore in the basis of the privileges. They just held on to them because they liked them and they couldn't imagine not having them. And I think some of that is what's going on now. And remember, if the government is half the economy, it means it's both the biggest customer for any major corporation, and it also has a regulatory power. And so there are powerful reasons of interest why you would go along. Those are very dangerous things, in my opinion, and they're everywhere. And can we get out of this? Well, we early in this conversation, we talked about the importance of education, right? People don't like this kind of government. It isn't popular. It never has been. And so it's got to be vulnerable. And above all, one thing one learns from the Republic is, what did Xenophon learn that Alcibiades did not? He learned that the life of the mind, the urgent effort to understand and place yourself in the right, that is the thing. And that's what's noble, and that's what's ambitious. And, you know, I can tell you, I'm in that line of work and argue successfully, young people respond to that.
Boy, do they ever respond to that. And all you have to do is visit Hillsdale, which you can do, by the way. Just go to Hillsdale. You can't miss the college. Or go to hillsdale.edu for all their video courses. For all things Hillsdale, it's hillsdale.edu. For the dialogues, 800 of them, Hugh for Hillsdale.com. That's Hugh for Hillsdale.com. Thank you. Talk to you Monday on the next Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.